All right, let's dive in today. We're exploring the Climate Justice and Equity Learning Lab.
Ooh, interesting.
It's a curriculum designed for high school educators.
Okay.
And the goal is pretty amazing, I think. It's to equip students to become, like, leaders in their communities
Yeah.
when it comes to climate change.
Leaders in their communities tackling climate change. I like it.
But here's the thing. It's not just about, the science.
Right.
Like-
Yeah, it's not just the science. It recognizes that climate change, it's not going to affect everyone equally.
Right.
The IPCC, they specifically say that vulnerable populations, they're going to be hit the hardest.
Oh, for sure.
We're talking about communities that are already dealing with, like, systemic challenges, poverty, lack of access to resources, discrimination. This curriculum really puts that right at the forefront.
It's like they're saying, hey, climate change is as much a social justice issue as it is an environmental one.
Absolutely.
And they've got some serious experts on the committee that put this together.
Right?
People like Melody Braun from Columbia Climate School.
It's impressive.
Monica de Oro.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she's a fellow with both NDN Collective and Climate Justice Alliance.
Wow.
And Christy Drutman.
Okay.
She's the founder of Brown Girl Green.
Yeah, so just those names alone, I mean, you can already tell they're looking at this from all these different angles.
Multifaceted.
Absolutely. And the way they structured the curriculum is interesting, too. They have this thing called the TCI method, which stands for Educate, Empower, and Activate. It's a 3-part journey that takes students from, learning the basics to actually going out and making a difference in their communities.
I love it. So break down that TCI method a little bit for me. What does the educate phase look like?
So the first 3 lessons, it's all about building that foundation. They're learning the science behind climate change.
Of course.
But it's deeper than that. They
Yeah.
learn how to actually interpret scientific data.
Oh, that's so important.
Which is such an important skill these days, right? We are bombarded with information all the time. Being able to look at data and be like, okay, what does this really mean? Especially with climate change, it's so important.
So true.
So important.
Yeah, absolutely. I said they also have this activity called 3 lenses.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Oh, that's a cool one. It's a way to get those critical thinking skills going. They analyze climate problems through 3 different lenses: economic, sociocultural, and ecological.
Okay.
So it forces them to consider the ripple effects. If you come up with a solution, it might have unintended consequences somewhere else.
For example, if you're trying to address climate change through economic policies, like a carbon tax, you'd have to think about how that impacts different socioeconomic groups.
Right, exactly. Yeah, carbon tax, it might be great for reducing emissions overall, but if it's not done carefully, it could really hurt low-income communities that are already struggling, right?
Yeah.
And then, what about the sociocultural side of things? How do we make sure that the solutions we're coming up with actually respect, different cultures and traditions?
That's a great point.
And then, of course, you've got the ecological lens.
Right.
We need to understand how all these living systems are connected and how climate change really messes with that balance.
Yeah, it's like they're getting a 360-degree view of the issue from the beginning.
They are from the get-go.
I love that.
Yeah, and they use a lot of case studies, too.
Okay.
Which is a great way to, bring those real-world examples into the classroom. They dive into real situations, looking at the impacts of climate change and analyzing solutions.
I like it.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They also look at the unintended consequences, even from solutions that were meant to be good.
So they're understanding that there's no easy fix.
Right. There's no magic bullet. It's about thinking carefully, analyzing, and realizing that there are a lot of different people involved, each with their own priorities.
Yeah.
It's messy, exactly. So they've built that foundational knowledge.
Yeah.
They're thinking critically.
Yeah.
So what happens next in this empower phase?
Okay, yeah, what's next?
This is where it starts to get personal. Lessons 4 and 5, they focus on bringing climate change home to the students,
Okay.
to their own communities and their own backyards.
I love that.
They start to see how this huge problem is actually playing out right where they live.
That makes it so much more real and urgent.
It does. It makes it real, urgent, personal.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So how do they do that? Well, they have this thing called the Youth Engagement Project, where students explore these local environmental problems that are directly impacting their community.
Wow.
So it could be anything, like air pollution or lack of green spaces or extreme heat, whatever really speaks to them.
Gotcha.
And they get to pick an issue that they're passionate about and then brainstorm ways to get their friends involved, to get other students excited about it.
So it's tapping into what they care about and using their voices.
Exactly. And it's not just about coming up with ideas on their own. They're encouraged to go out into their communities, talk to experts, talk to people who are experiencing these problems firsthand.
This real change happens at the community level.
It does, absolutely. And that's what this whole curriculum is about, giving young people the tools to be active citizens who get it, who understand climate change, and who are ready to make a difference.
I think it's important, before we move on to the activate phase,
Mm-hmm.
to really dig into these concepts of climate justice and equity,
Yeah, for sure.
because this curriculum is built on those ideas.
It is.
But I think it's worth taking a minute to really understand what those terms mean.
Absolutely. It's easy to just throw those words around,
Right.
but we need to know what's behind them. And this curriculum does a good job of explaining that, that climate change, it's not going to affect everyone the same way.
Mm-hmm.
That some communities are way more vulnerable because of what's happened in the past and the systems we have in place.
Yeah, we've touched on that a bit, but can we go a little deeper? What are those historical and systemic injustices that make certain communities more vulnerable?
Well, one of the biggest things is environmental racism.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the fact that, communities of color and low-income communities, they're exposed to more environmental hazards like pollution from factories, toxic waste, even things like highways and airports.
Not random, right?
No, it's not random at all.
Like where these things are located.
Right. And these communities are often in places that are more likely to be affected by things like flooding and extreme heat, climate change impacts. And it's not a coincidence. These are the same communities that have been denied access to resources, denied a say in what happens in their own neighborhoods. That's made them way more vulnerable to this kind of environmental injustice.
So it's this whole legacy of discrimination and systemic inequality that's created these differences in the first place.
Exactly. And we can't ignore that history, because it helps us understand that climate change, it's not just about the science. It's tied to social justice.
Yeah. It's about realizing that the people who did the least to cause climate change are often the ones who are suffering the most.
Exactly. And that's where equity comes in.
Okay.
It's not about treating everyone the same.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we all start from different places.
Yeah.
It's about creating a level playing field so that everyone has a fair chance at a healthy, sustainable future.
So it's about giving some communities more support than others because of what they've been through.
Exactly. And that support needs to be tailored to what each community needs, taking into account their challenges and their values.
Yeah, it's about giving them a voice.
Absolutely. Giving them a voice in the decisions that affect them.
And this curriculum also talks about land acknowledgement, right?
Yeah, that's an important piece of this. It's about honoring the history and the struggles of Indigenous peoples, particularly when it comes to land and environmental justice.
Okay.
It's recognizing that the land we're on was taken from them and that they still face so much oppression.
So acknowledging that history.
Yes, it's a small step, but it's a step towards reconciliation and understanding the impact of colonialism.
That makes sense. It's about recognizing the history of the land we're on and the people who were here before us. And the curriculum also looks at the global dimension of this, right? The disparities between the global north and the global south.
Oh, absolutely. This is where those historical patterns of colonialism and resource extraction really matter.
Okay.
The global north, with its history of industrialization, we're responsible for most of the climate change.
Right.
But it's the global south that often faces the worst consequences. Rising sea levels, droughts, extreme weather.
Not fair.
Not at all. And they often don't have the resources to deal with those impacts.
And it's not just about emissions from the past, right?
Yeah.
It's about how we live now.
Exactly. We in the global north, we're still consuming way too much.
We are.
And that has a direct impact on communities in the global south.
Wow. This is a lot to think about, but it's so important to understand all of this when we're talking about climate change.
It is. It's not just about cutting emissions.
Right.
It's about addressing the deeper causes of injustice and inequality.
And that's what makes this curriculum so groundbreaking.
Yeah.
It's not just about the science.
Right.
It's about understanding the systems that got us into this mess.
The systems of power.
And giving students the tools to change those systems.
To be those change makers.
And create a future that works for everyone.
A just and sustainable future for all.
I love it.
And this curriculum really brings it home, It's not just talking about these big abstract ideas. They give you, hard-hitting facts.
Okay, like what?
Did you know that people of color in the U.S., they're exposed to up to 63% more pollution than they produce?
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's a huge difference.
It is. And white people, they're exposed to 17% less pollution than they produce.
So it's like they're benefiting from a system that's harming others.
Yeah, it's a real example of environmental injustice.
And it's not just air pollution, right?
No, it's not. Think about coal-fired power plants.
Okay.
68% of Black people live within 30 miles of one of those.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that high.
And those plants, they release all these harmful pollutants.
Right. The stuff that causes respiratory problems and all that.
Exactly. Respiratory problems, heart disease, even cancer.
It's like all these environmental dangers are concentrated in communities that are already struggling.
Yeah, communities that are already disadvantaged.
And then climate change comes along, makes everything worse.
Exactly. They're hit harder by extreme heat, flooding, you name it.
And they often don't have the resources to adapt or recover as easily.
Right. It's a recipe for disaster.
It really is. And this curriculum, it doesn't shy away from those hard truths, does it?
It doesn't. It paints a very real picture of the problem. The projections are honestly kind of scary. By 2030, climate change is projected to contribute to 250,000 deaths every year.
Wow, 250,000 deaths.
Globally, every year. That's less than 6 years away.
That's really sobering.
It is.
Oh,
This
yeah.
isn't some far-off problem. It's happening now.
Yeah, climate change is already here.
It is.
And this curriculum, it's not just about raising awareness.
Right.
It's about giving students the tools to actually do something.
Exactly. Moving beyond knowledge and into action.
So how do they do that? How do they take these big ideas and turn them into actual learning experiences? How do they go from understanding the problem to actually addressing it?
Well, they've got a lot of different approaches,
Oh,
but
boy.
one that's really interesting is their use of something called a Bitmoji classroom.
A Bitmoji classroom.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, right?
Yeah, I've never heard of that. What is it?
So basically, it's this online space where students can explore all these different resources related to climate justice and equity.
So it's like a virtual library or something.
Yeah, you could think of it like that. Or maybe like a virtual museum.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah, it's a clever way to engage students, especially since, they're all digital natives these days.
Absolutely. Meet them where they are.
sure.
Right? So what kind of resources are we talking about?
Oh, there's so much packed in there. For instance, they have this really striking map from NOAA.
Yeah.
It shows the projected future heat events across the U.S.
Wow.
So you can actually see how different regions are going to be affected by those rising temperatures.
Oh, that's powerful.
Yeah, you can really visualize which areas are going to be hit the hardest. And a lot of times, those are the areas that are already struggling.
What makes it very real?
It does. And then they've got this fascinating case study about children in Ecuador.
Okay.
They're actually suing the oil industry over this thing called gas flaring on indigenous land.
Oh, wow. Suing the oil industry. That's huge.
It's a pretty amazing example of youth activism.
Yeah.
Young people standing up and fighting for environmental justice.
I'd love to hear more about that case.
So gas flaring, it's this practice in the oil and gas industry where they basically burn off excess natural gas.
Right.
It's like they're getting rid of unwanted gas, but it releases all these harmful pollutants into the air, including methane, which is, a super potent greenhouse gas.
So, bad for the climate, bad for the environment.
Exactly. And guess where these gas flares are often located?
Near communities.
Near indigenous communities. And it's devastating for their health and their environment.
So it's like a double whammy.
It is. The pollution is linked to all sorts of problems, respiratory issues, skin rashes, even birth defects, and it contaminates their water and their crops.
These kids are saying enough is enough.
They are. They're taking on a powerful industry to fight for their rights and the health of their communities.
That's incredibly brave.
It is really inspiring.
And it's not just about confronting these big corporations.
Right.
It's also about working within communities to find solutions.
Absolutely. And the Bitmoji classroom, they highlight this great story about the Yurok tribe.
Okay.
They're working to restore their local environment and the salmon population.
Oh, I've heard a little bit about that. What are they doing specifically?
So the Yurok tribe, they're the biggest federally recognized tribe in California. And their ancestral land includes the Klamath River, which used to be full of salmon.
Right. Salmon are so important to their culture.
They are, culturally, spiritually, economically.
Yeah.
But dams, logging, all these human activities have decimated the salmon population.
So they're trying to bring them back.
Exactly, trying to restore the health of the river. They're working to remove dams that block the salmon migration.
Wow.
They're restoring habitats along the river.
Yes,
They're improving water quality and even reintroducing salmon into areas where they had disappeared.
That's amazing. It's such a holistic approach.
It is really impressive. And it's working. The salmon are starting to come back and the river is getting healthier.
That's such good news.
It is. It's a great example of how indigenous communities are leading the way when it comes to protecting the environment and building resilience to climate change.
I love that this Bitmoji classroom has all these different resources, all these different perspectives.
It does. It's really well curated.
But it's not just about reading and watching, right?
Mm.
They have activities too.
They do. Lots of interactive stuff to get students thinking.
Like what?
Well, one activity they talk about is called data interpretation.
Okay.
And it focuses on data literacy.
That's such an important skill these days.
It is. We're drowning in data.
We are.
So they use visuals, maps, charts, graphs
Right.
to help students understand what the data is actually saying.
Because data can be overwhelming.
Oh, for sure, especially when we're talking about something as complex as climate change. But visuals can help make it more digestible.
Absolutely. What kind of data are they looking at?
Well, one example they use is a map showing per capita CO2 emissions by country.
Okay.
It really shows the stark differences between nations, how consumption patterns in the global north are fueling the climate crisis.
It's a powerful visual representation of those inequalities.
It is, and it gets students thinking about, equity, responsibility, what a just transition to a sustainable future would look like.
And speaking of just transitions, they also have this Bring It Home project.
Yeah, the Youth Engagement Project.
Right, where they connect the global to the local. Tell me more about that.
So in this project, students choose a local environmental problem that they care about.
Okay.
And they come up with a plan to get their peers involved in finding solutions.
So it could be anything from air pollution to lack of green spaces.
Exactly, whatever resonates with them.
I love that they get to choose.
Yeah, it gives them ownership.
So how do they actually engage their peers?
That's where their creativity comes in.
Okay.
The curriculum offers some suggestions, but they really encourage the students to come up with their own approaches.
So some students might create social media campaigns.
Right.
Others might organize community events.
Yeah.
Maybe even contact their elected officials.
Exactly. They're learning how to be advocates for change, how to use their voices.
I bet they draw inspiration from real-world examples of youth activism.
They do. They learn about movements like the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, where young people played a huge role in raising awareness.
Oh, yeah, that was such a powerful movement.
It was. And it shows that you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can start now.
I love that message.
It's about empowering young people.
Yeah.
To see themselves as agents of change.
So important. Now, we've talked a lot about the content of the curriculum, but I'm also curious about the emphasis on communication.
Yeah, that's key.
Because we live in this world where information is constantly coming at us.
We do.
And it's so important to be able to cut through the noise and communicate effectively, especially when you're talking about something as complex as climate change.
Absolutely. And this curriculum, it really stresses those communication skills.
Oh, good.
They learn how to tell compelling stories, how to use social media, how to connect with different audiences.
Can you give me some examples of how they do that?
Sure. They have activities that focus on different storytelling tools.
Okay.
Like podcasts.
Love it.
Visual art, even music.
Oh, wow.
It's about using all these different mediums to connect with people on an emotional level and get them to act.
So it's about finding creative ways to bring the message of climate justice to life.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that different people connect with different forms of communication.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. So they're learning to be adaptable, to find the right approach for the right audience.
It's not just about knowing the facts. It's about being able to share them effectively.
Right. It's about communication. It's about advocacy.
And all of these different elements of the curriculum, they work together so well.
They do. It's really well designed.
It all builds up to this final project, the action project.
Exactly. That's the culmination of everything.
This is where they put all their learning into action, right?
Yes. This is where they become the change makers.
I love it. So tell me about it. What do they actually do?
In the action project, students get to design and carry out their own projects to address a local climate justice issue.
So they get to be creative, innovative.
They do, and they get to make a real difference in their communities. So we've talked about all these different pieces, building the knowledge, understanding the issues, learning how to communicate.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is, but it all leads up to this, the action project.
Okay, tell me everything.
This is where the students really get to put everything they've learned into practice.
So they're taking those big ideas about climate justice and equity and actually doing something real.
Exactly. They become the change makers in their own communities.
I'm so excited to hear about this. So what does it involve? What do they actually do?
Basically, they work in teams to choose a local climate justice problem, something that they're passionate about.
So they're not just handed a project. They get to choose something that speaks to them.
Exactly. It gives them ownership.
And
But then they have to come up with a plan to address it.
So it's like a real-world problem-solving challenge.
It is. And the curriculum gives them some guidance, but it really encourages them to be creative, to think outside the box.
Okay, so give me some examples. What are some of the things students have actually done?
Oh, there are so many amazing stories. One that comes to mind is a group of students who were really worried about access to healthy food in their community.
Okay, food access, that's a big one.
It is, especially in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. They learned about food deserts.
Right, where it's hard to find fresh produce.
Exactly, and these students wanted to do something about it.
So what do?
They decided to create a community garden.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It was, but it wasn't easy.
I'm sure.
They had to find land, raise money for supplies, get people to help with the planting and everything.
It's a lot of work.
It is, but they were determined, and in the end, they created this beautiful, thriving community garden.
I love it.
And it became more than just a place to grow food.
Right. It brings people together.
It does. It builds community.
That's amazing. It's such a testament to what young people can achieve.
It really is. Okay, another example.
Yes.
Another group of students, they were really bothered by how much waste their school was producing.
Okay, waste reduction, another huge issue.
Huge. And they had learned about landfills and how they contribute to climate change and pollute the environment.
Right. Landfills are a major problem.
And they wanted their school to do better.
What did they come up with?
They started a school-wide composting program.
Oh, that's smart.
It was. They collected food scraps from the cafeteria, set up compost bins, taught their classmates about composting.
So they were turning waste into a resource.
Exactly. They were reducing their environmental impact and creating nutrient-rich compost for their school gardens.
I love these stories. They're so inspiring. It's like those action projects have this ripple effect.
They do. They go beyond the classroom.
And they can lead to real, lasting change.
Absolutely. Some students have even convinced their schools to install solar panels or switch to renewable energy.
Wow, they're really making a difference.
They are. They're showing that young people can be powerful advocates for change.
This curriculum, it's incredible.
It is. It's about so much more than just learning about climate change.
Right, it's about empowering students, giving them the tools and the confidence to create a better world.
Exactly, to be those change makers.
Well, I think this has been an amazing deep dive into the Climate Justice and Equity Learning Lab.
It has. It's a really impressive curriculum.
And I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to take action themselves.
Me too.
Yeah.
Remember, everyone has a role to play.
We can all do something, whether it's making more sustainable choices in our own lives or supporting organizations working for climate justice.
And we can use our voices.
Yes. Speak up. Demand change from our leaders.
We have the power to create a more just and sustainable future, but we have to act.
So let's do it. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something, and we hope you're ready to be part of the solution.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep fighting for a better future for all.